When I discovered my cheating husband's secret stash of personal lubricant hidden in his car, I made a decision that would change everything. I quietly swapped it with industrial-strength superglue. 3 days later, my neighbor was frantically dialing 911, screaming that 2 people were stuck together and needed the fire department immediately. That's when I knew my 40 years of marriage had finally taught me something valuable about chemistry. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. The morning sun cast long shadows across my perfectly manicured lawn as I knelt among the rose bushes, my gardening gloves dark with soil. 43 years I'd been tending this garden, watching it bloom and flourish, while my marriage slowly withered away like autumn leaves. I was adjusting the sprinkler when I saw him, Mike, supposedly headed to his morning jog, but instead of turning toward the park, he was crossing the street toward Crystal Martinez's house. He was dressed in his running gear, but something about his purposeful stride told me this wasn't about exercise. Crystal emerged from her front door wearing a silk robe that barely reached her mid-thigh. Her platinum blonde hair tousled as if she'd just rolled out of bed. She was 28 years old. I was 62. What I witnessed next made my blood turn to ice. The way she moved toward him wasn't the casual greeting of a neighbor. It was predatory, intimate, familiar. Her hand lingered on his arm as she spoke, her body positioned just a little too close for innocent conversation. Mike glanced around the neighborhood with the careful attention of a man checking for witnesses. When his gaze landed on me kneeling in my garden, visible in my dirt-stained clothes and wide-brimmed sun hat, something shifted in his expression. For a moment, I thought I saw guilt flash across his face, but then he smiled, that same charming smile that had won me over at 22, and raised his hand in a casual wave. "Morning, Beth," he called out, his voice carrying that jovial tone he used when he wanted to deflect attention. "Crystal's having some trouble with her kitchen sink. You know how these old houses can be." Then she laughed at something he said, throwing her head back in a gesture so theatrical it could only mean one thing. She was performing for an audience, and the audience was me. Crystal's laughter carried across the street, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to echo off every house in the neighborhood. She placed her hand on Mike's lower back, a gesture so intimate and possessive that it spoke louder than words, and guided him inside her house. The garden hose slipped from my trembling fingers, water spraying wildly across the sidewalk. I stood frozen, dirt-stained and invisible, while my husband disappeared into another woman's home under the pretense of neighborly assistance. "Oh, honey." Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted from her porch next door, syrupy with false sympathy and barely concealed excitement at having witnessed such drama. "Did you see that too? At 7:30 in the morning?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because 40 years of my life had just crumbled to dust in the span of 30 seconds, and I was still trying to process the magnitude of what I'd witnessed. Mike remained in Crystal's house for 2 hours. 2 hours while I stood in my garden, water pooling around my feet, watching the drawn curtains of her bedroom window, and understanding with crystalline clarity that my marriage was over. When he finally emerged, his running clothes were wrinkled, and he jogged home with the satisfied swagger. That evening, Mike came home at his usual time, whistling some tune I didn't recognize. The melody was unfamiliar, probably something Crystal had been humming. He hung his keys on the same hook he'd used for 20 years, the small silver key ring catching the kitchen light like a mocking wink. He kissed my forehead with lips that had been on another woman just hours before, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to his collar. Something expensive and cloying, nothing like the subtle lavender I'd worn for decades. "How was your day, honey?" he asked, loosening his tie like he always did, his fingers working the knot with practiced efficiency. "Enlightening," I replied, watching his face carefully for any sign of guilt or recognition. He didn't even flinch. 40 years of marriage, and this man could lie to me without batting an eye. His expression remained perfectly neutral, the same polite interest he might show a grocery store clerk. "Mine was pretty routine," he said, heading toward the stairs. "Just the usual client meetings. Might be late again tomorrow. That Henderson account is requiring a lot of attention." Henderson account. Even his lies had become lazy. Later, when the sound of running water from our master bathroom told me Mike was safely in the shower, I found myself drawn to his car like a moth to flame. The garage felt cavernous and cold, filled with 40 years of accumulated possessions that suddenly felt like evidence of a life I'd never really lived. I told myself I was just getting the grocery bags he'd forgotten, but my hands were shaking as I opened the glove compartment. The leather interior smelled like his cologne and something else. Something feminine and foreign that made my stomach turn. There it was, a tube of personal lubricant, an expensive brand, barely used, the kind you couldn't buy at a regular pharmacy, the kind that required a special trip to an adult store. Hidden beneath insurance papers and registration documents like a guilty secret, nestled next to a receipt from a lingerie shop I'd never heard of. I picked up the tube with trembling fingers, noting its weight, its texture, and the way the cap had been recently opened. The expiration date was still 2 years away, which meant Mike had bought this recently. Very recently. My mind began racing back to my college chemistry classes. Concepts I hadn't thought about in decades, suddenly crystal clear. Polymers. Molecular bonds, irreversible reactions, the way certain compounds could mimic others until activated under specific conditions. Chemistry was always my best subject, I whispered to the empty garage, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. I carefully returned the tube to its hiding place and closed the glove compartment with infinite care. But something had fundamentally changed at that moment. The woman who walked back into the house was no longer the same person who had discovered her husband's betrayal that morning. She was someone more dangerous, someone with knowledge, someone with a plan beginning to form in the dark corners of her mind. That night, I lay in bed listening to Mike's satisfied snoring while memories flooded back like a dam bursting. The sound of his breathing had once comforted me. Now it felt like mockery, each exhale a reminder of how completely I'd been deceived. I remembered being 22, brilliant and accepted to MIT's doctoral program in chemistry. I remembered holding that acceptance letter with trembling hands, reading and rereading the words that would have changed everything. "We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship for our doctoral program in organic chemistry." I remembered Mike's persuasive voice that night over dinner at the little Italian restaurant where he'd first told me he loved me. "Come on, Beth. Do you really want to spend the next 6 years in a lab when we could be building a life together? We could have the house, the white picket fence, maybe even kids. Isn't that worth more than some dusty degree?" I remembered looking into his earnest blue eyes, seeing what I thought was love and devotion and feeling my resolve crumble. "But this is my dream, Mike. I've wanted to be a research chemist since I was 12. "Dreams change, sweetheart," he'd said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I'm offering you a better dream. A real life with real meaning. What's more important, discovering some new compound that nobody will remember in 50 years, or building something lasting with the man who loves you?" I remembered folding that acceptance letter in half, then quarters, then throwing it away in the restaurant's bathroom trash can. I remembered crying in that bathroom stall for 10 minutes before washing my face and returning to Mike with a smile that felt like broken glass. I remembered teaching elementary school instead, telling myself it was temporary, just until Mike got established in his career. I remembered watching him climb the corporate ladder while I remained frozen in time, teaching the same lessons year after year to children who reminded me of the dreams I'd abandoned. I remembered Mike's promotions, his business trips that grew longer and more frequent, his gradual transformation from the boy who'd promised to love me forever to the man who now treated me like convenient furniture. I remembered the slow erosion of his interest, The way he stopped really seeing me somewhere around year 20. The way conversations became perfunctory exchanges about schedules and household maintenance. I remembered 20 years of cooking his favorite meals only to watch him push them around his plate while scrolling through his phone. I remembered ironing his shirts with military precision, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues where I smiled and played the perfect wife while he ignored me completely. I remembered entertaining his clients, laughing at their jokes, charming their wives, all while slowly disappearing until I became invisible even to myself. But most of all, I remembered my chemistry textbooks, stored in boxes in the basement like fossils of the woman I used to be. Organic Chemistry by Morrison and Boyd, Advanced Polymer Science by Stevens, Reaction Mechanisms in Organic Chemistry by Sykes. Books I'd once devoured like novels, concepts that had excited me more than any romance. The next morning, while Mike was at his gym session, I now knew better, I retrieved those boxes from the basement. My fingers traced the yellowed pages of organic chemistry principles, and something dark and calculating stirred in my chest. The knowledge was still there, dormant but intact, like muscle memory waiting to be awakened. I found my old notebook from Organic Chemistry 3, my own handwriting documenting experiments with adhesive compounds. There, in my careful 21-year-old script, were detailed notes about cyanoacrylates, their bonding properties, and their resistance to separation once polymerized. Irreversible under normal conditions, I had written, requires specialized solvents and potential medical intervention for removal from skin. I closed the notebook and smiled for the first time in months. Revenge, I realized, was just another kind of chemical reaction, and I was about to become a very dangerous woman. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched, I learned, I documented, and most importantly, I planned. Mike's behavior had become predictably despicable. His golf games on Tuesday afternoons that never involved actual golf clubs or courses. His late client meetings on Friday evenings that somehow required him to shower and change clothes beforehand. The way he hummed in the shower after returning from Crystal's house, smelling like her cloying perfume and the musk of satisfied adultery. I began keeping a journal, recording everything with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting a long-term experiment. Time of departure, duration of absence, physical evidence upon return. I photographed receipts he carelessly left in his pockets, restaurants I'd never been to, hotels in our own city, charges from Victoria's Secret that certainly weren't for me. My training as a teacher had taught me the value of documentation, but my chemistry background taught me something more valuable: patience. The best reactions couldn't be rushed. They required precise conditions, careful preparation, and perfect timing. Crystal, meanwhile, grew bolder with each passing day. She'd wave from her window when she saw me in the garden, that same predatory smile never leaving her perfectly glossed lips. Sometimes she'd wear Mike's shirts while watering her plants, making sure I could see the distinctive monogram on the cuff shirts I'd given him for Christmas just 6 months ago. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and deliberate. Crystal understood that destroying a marriage required more than just seduction. It required the complete demoralization of the existing wife. She was trying to make me give up, to surrender without a fight, to quietly disappear so she could slide into my life without any messy complications. "She's really quite shameless," Janet Morrison said one afternoon, joining me at my fence with 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. My friend of 30 years had been watching the drama unfold with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a slow-motion car crash. "Everyone's talking, Beth. The whole neighborhood knows what's happening." "Let them talk," I said, deadheading roses with perhaps more violence than necessary. The satisfying snap of the stems between my pruning shears provided a small outlet for the rage building inside me. People will always find something to gossip about. But don't you think you should do something? Talk to Mike? Confront her? This can't go on. Janet meant well, but she didn't understand. This wasn't about stopping their affair. It was too late for that. This was about ensuring that their betrayal came with consequences they'd never forget. "I am doing something," I told her, my voice steady as granite. "I'm learning." Janet gave me a puzzled look, but she didn't press. Smart woman, my friend Janet. She'd learned over the years that I wasn't the type to make impulsive decisions, but inside I was burning. Every pitying glance from neighbors, every whispered conversation that stopped when I entered the grocery store, every knowing look from the mailman who'd probably watched Mike's Mercedes in Crystal's driveway, they all fed the fire growing in my chest. The humiliation was systematic and public, designed to break my spirit and my resistance. What Crystal didn't understand was that she wasn't breaking me. She was forging me into something much more dangerous. That evening, while Mike was working late, really at Crystal's house for what had become their regular Friday evening rendezvous, I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up my phone and called directory assistance. "Could you connect me to MIT's chemistry department, please?" The final straw came on our 40th wedding anniversary, a day that should have been sacred, but instead became the tombstone for any remaining hope I harbored for our marriage. I'd spent the morning preparing Mike's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the same recipe I'd made for 4 decades. The recipe had come from his mother, passed down with solemn ceremony during our first year of marriage. "The way to a man's heart," she'd said with a knowing wink. How naive we'd both been. I'd even bought a small cake from Rosemary's Bakery, the same place where we'd ordered our wedding cake all those years ago. The baker, now gray-haired and wearing reading glasses, had remembered me after all these years. "40th anniversary," she'd exclaimed. "How wonderful! You must be so proud." I'd smiled and nodded, playing the part of the happy wife while my heart crumbled like stale cake. The dining room table looked exactly as it had on our first anniversary. White tablecloth, good china, candles in the silver holders we'd received as wedding gifts. I'd even worn the blue dress Mike had once said brought out my eyes, though I couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at me long enough to notice. Mike came home 3 hours late, reeking of Crystal's perfume and something else, something musky and satisfied that made my stomach turn. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled in a way that had nothing to do with work stress. "Oh shit," he said when he saw the candles on the dining room table, his face contorting with annoyance rather than guilt. "Is today our anniversary?" I finished quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. 40 years, Mike. 4 decades of marriage. He ran his hand through his graying hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing when we were young and everything was possible. Now it just looked calculated, rehearsed, like he was buying time to construct the right lie. "We can celebrate next weekend," he said dismissively, not even bothering to look at the feast I'd prepared or acknowledge the effort I'd made. "I've got that important client dinner tomorrow night. The Henderson account, you know how demanding they are." I knew there was no Henderson account. I knew tomorrow night he'd be at Crystal's house, probably celebrating their own twisted version of an anniversary. But I said nothing, just watched him disappear upstairs to shower off the scent of his betrayal. The pot roast grew cold while I sat alone at our anniversary table, staring at the cake that suddenly looked like a monument to my own foolishness. 40 years, 14,600 days of marriage, and this was what it had become. But Saturday came, and Mike spent the entire day at Crystal's house. I watched from my kitchen window as she answered the door in a negligee so sheer it might as well have been made of wishful thinking. She pulled him inside with hands that had no right to touch what was mine, and they disappeared for 6 hours. 6 hours of whatever passed for romance in that den of betrayal while I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the anniversary dinner he'd forgotten, planning his destruction with the methodical precision of the scientist I'd once been. That night, I discovered Mike had opened a separate bank account, $50,000 money from our joint savings, transferred without my knowledge or consent. When I confronted him, his mask finally slipped. "It's my money," he snarled, his face contorting with rage I'd never seen before. "I earned it." You've never contributed a dime to this household. You're nothing but a burden, Beth. A middle-aged housewife with no skills, no prospects, and no value. The words hit me like physical blows. I stood there in our kitchen, the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, packed countless lunches, cleaned up after decades of his messes, and felt something inside me break. But it wasn't my spirit that broke. It was my last thread of mercy. The neighborhood barbecue was supposed to be a celebration of community spirit, our annual gathering to strengthen the bonds between neighbors. Instead, it became the stage for my public execution. Crystal arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that ensured every eye was on her. She wore a dress that could barely be called clothing, a scrap of red fabric that clung to her surgically enhanced curves. Behind her confident smile, I caught a glimpse of something else: calculation. This wasn't just about seducing Mike. This was about conquering territory, claiming what she saw as rightfully hers. There was something else about Crystal that I hadn't noticed before, a hardness behind her eyes that spoke of desperation rather than confidence. She wasn't just a young woman seducing an older man for fun. She was a predator with her own agenda, and Mike was just another mark in whatever long-term game she was playing. That realization would prove crucial to my plan. Mike followed 2 steps behind her like a trained dog, his arm linked possessively through hers. He introduced her to neighbors who already knew exactly who she was and what she represented. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Crystal Martinez," Mike announced with the pride of a man showing off a prize trophy. "She's our lovely neighbor, and she's been helping me with some personal projects." I stood by the potato salad table, watching my husband feed grapes to another woman, while our friends and neighbors pretended not to notice. Crystal giggled at everything Mike said, her hand trailing down his chest with practiced intimacy. The psychological torture was expertly executed. Every touch, every laugh, every intimate whisper was calculated to maximize my humiliation while maintaining just enough plausible deniability. "Maybe you should talk to Mike," Mrs. Williams whispered when she approached the food table, her voice heavy with pity and embarrassment. "This display is becoming quite uncomfortable for everyone." "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my voice steady as glass despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Some conversations are held in different languages." Mrs. Williams looked puzzled by my response, but she didn't press. None of them understood that I was already speaking Mike's language. I was just using a dialect he didn't recognize yet. The evening reached its crescendo when Crystal decided to deliver the coup de grace. She approached me directly. "Beth," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet patio, "Mike's told me so much about you. It must be hard, keeping up with a man like him at your age." The conversations around us stopped. Neighbors turned to watch this public dismantling of my dignity. "I mean," Crystal continued, her voice getting louder, "maybe it's time to consider your options. This neighborhood is really more suited for active people." Mike just stood there, saying nothing, while his mistress publicly humiliated his wife of 40 years. I smiled then, a smile that felt like shattered glass. "You're absolutely right, Crystal. It is time to consider my options." And I walked away, leaving behind the ruins of my reputation and the last of my restraint. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and broken dreams. Mike sat across from me, his attorney by his side, laying out terms that would leave me with scraps while he sailed off into the sunset with his young mistress. "Mrs. Thompson will receive 30% of marital assets," the lawyer announced with clinical detachment. "Given her lack of financial contribution and limited earning potential at her age, this is quite generous." "Generous?" I stared at this man who was dissecting my life like a specimen. I gave up my career to support him. I maintained his home, raised his social standing, sacrificed my dreams for his ambitions. Mike's lawyer shrugged. "Emotional contributions don't translate to financial equity, Mrs. Thompson. The law is quite clear on this matter." Mike himself said nothing, just studied his manicured fingernails while my life was reduced to dollar signs and percentages. "You'll keep the house," Mike finally spoke, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm keeping the investments, retirement funds, and business assets. Crystal and I are planning to travel." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. 40 years of marriage, dismissed as easily as changing his shirt. But Crystal wasn't satisfied with just taking my husband. She wanted to salt the earth of my existence, to ensure that I had nothing left to cling to when she was finished with me. I discovered the truth while sorting through financial documents for the divorce, a task that should have been routine, but instead became an archaeological dig into the depths of my husband's betrayal. Hidden among bank statements and investment portfolios, I found documents that made my blood turn to ice. Mike had secretly mortgaged our home, my home, to invest in something called Golden Horizon Travel Ventures. The paperwork was dated 6 months ago, signed in Mike's distinctive scrawl with a notary stamp I didn't recognize. He'd forged my signature with stunning accuracy, practicing my handwriting until he could replicate it perfectly. A company that existed only on paper, registered to one Crystal Martinez at an address I'd never heard of. The business license was fake, the registration fabricated, the entire enterprise nothing more than an elaborate shell game designed to funnel money from legitimate bank accounts into Crystal's personal coffers. My husband hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been stealing from me to fund his mistress's fraudulent schemes, using our home as collateral for her con games. The house I'd called home for 35 years, where I'd hung pictures and planted gardens and built a life one careful day at a time, all of it was now collateral for Crystal's theft. But the revelation grew worse as I dug deeper. Bank records showed Mike had been transferring money for months. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting. Credit cards had been opened in both our names, maxed out on purchases I'd never seen. Jewelry, expensive dinners, hotel rooms in cities we'd never visited together. Crystal had been bleeding us dry with surgical precision, and Mike had been helping her do it. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of systematic financial abuse, and finally understood the full scope of their conspiracy. This wasn't just an affair, it was organized crime. They weren't just stealing my husband, they were stealing my entire future. The house I'd nurtured for decades, the garden I'd cultivated with my own hands, the sanctuary I'd built one careful day at a time, all of it was collateral for Crystal's con game. If their scheme succeeded, I wouldn't just lose my marriage. I'd lose everything, left destitute and homeless while they sailed off into the sunset with my life savings. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, like tarot cards spelling out my doom, and felt something cold and implacable settle in my chest. Crystal had made a fundamental miscalculation in her grand plan. She'd assumed I was just another victim, another naive wife too trusting to see the truth until it was too late. But she'd never bothered to research her mark properly. She didn't know about my chemistry background, my gift for systematic analysis, my ability to plan and execute complex procedures with scientific precision. Crystal thought she was playing chess with an amateur. She was about to discover she'd entered a chemical weapons fight with a trained scientist. Crystal's visit came on a Tuesday afternoon, perfectly timed for maximum psychological impact. She knocked on my door wearing designer jeans and a smirk that could cut glass. Behind her, parked deliberately in my driveway, sat a brand new BMW convertible. "Beth!" she exclaimed with theatrical surprise. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by." Mike gave me a key, in case of emergencies. She dangled my own house key in front of my face like a taunt. "I wanted to discuss the transition," she continued, stepping uninvited into my foyer. "Mike and I think it would be best if you moved out before the divorce is finalized. Maybe find a nice little apartment. Something more age-appropriate." I watched this woman, this child, walk through my home like she owned it, touching my photographs, running her fingers along my furniture with the confidence of a conqueror. "The master bedroom has such lovely morning light," she mused, standing in the doorway of the room where I'd slept for decades. "We're thinking of redecorating. Something more modern, less elderly." "Get out," I said quietly. "Oh, Beth." Crystal turned to me with mock sympathy. "I know this is hard, but you need to face reality. Mike doesn't love you anymore. He probably never did. You're just a convenience he's finally ready to discard." "Get out of my house." "Technically," she smiled, producing a folder of documents, "it's not really your house anymore, is it?" Mike's been very thorough in his planning. I looked at this woman who was systematically destroying everything I'd built, everything I'd loved, everything I was, and felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. "You're right," I said finally. "It is time to face reality." Crystal's smile widened, thinking she'd won. She had no idea what reality was about to look like. That night, alone in my house that was no longer truly mine, I descended into the basement for the first time in years. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each groan a reminder of the decades I'd spent avoiding this space, this repository of dreams I'd abandoned. Behind boxes of Christmas decorations and forgotten dreams, past Mike's golf clubs that rarely saw actual golf courses anymore, I found my old chemistry equipment. The cardboard boxes were water-stained and yellowed with age, but when I opened them, the contents were perfectly preserved, like archaeological artifacts from the woman I used to be. Most of it was outdated, relics from my undergraduate days at State University. But there, nestled in a case I'd forgotten existed, wrapped in tissue paper like a sleeping serpent, was a small vial of industrial-grade cyanoacrylate. A sample I'd borrowed from the lab 40 years ago for a project I never finished, hidden away and forgotten until this moment when fate had conspired to remind me of its existence. I held the vial up to the harsh basement light, reading the faded label with the careful attention of a scholar studying ancient text. "Caution. Irreversible bonding in seconds. Skin contact may require medical intervention. For industrial use only. Perfect." I'd spent 3 months watching Mike and Crystal, learning their patterns, documenting their movements like a scientist studying lab rats. Tuesday afternoons and Friday evenings at Crystal's house. Always the same routine. Mike would arrive at 2:30 sharp. Crystal would answer the door in various states of undress designed to inflame his aging libido, and they'd disappear into her bedroom for exactly 2 hours. Clockwork, predictable and exploitable. Chemistry has always been about transformation, taking one substance and changing it into something completely different. Tomorrow, I would transform Mike and Crystal from predators into prisoners, from conspirators into cautionary tales. The next Tuesday morning, I waited until Mike left for his gym session, really just a preliminary visit to Crystal's before their afternoon rendezvous. I'd been tracking his schedule for months, and his routine was as predictable as a chemical reaction under controlled conditions. At exactly 9:15, Mike emerged from our bedroom wearing his workout clothes and the cologne he only used for special occasions. He kissed my cheek with the perfunctory affection of a man going through the motions, grabbed his gym bag, and headed for the garage. "Don't wait up," he called over his shoulder. "I might grab lunch with the guys after." The guys. Even his lies had become lazy and unimaginative. I watched from the kitchen window as his Mercedes backed out of our driveway and disappeared down Maple Street. Then I counted to 60, ensuring he was truly gone, before making my move. His car keys hung on the hook by the garage door, the same place they'd been for 20 years. I let myself into the Mercedes, breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with Crystal's perfume that seemed to have permanently permeated the leather seats. The glove compartment opened with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the quiet garage. The tube of lubricant sat exactly where I'd last seen it, nestled between insurance papers and registration documents like a guilty secret. I removed it carefully, noting the weight, the consistency, the way the cap twisted off with practiced ease. Back in my kitchen, I worked with the precision of the scientist I'd once been, the woman I was about to become again. The industrial adhesive had the same consistency as personal lubricant, the same clear appearance that would fool even careful inspection. Under my magnifying glass, a relic from my teaching days when I'd helped students with science projects, the two substances were virtually indistinguishable. I transferred the cyanoacrylate to the original tube with surgical precision, using a small funnel I'd fashioned from rolled paper. The weight was perfect, the consistency identical. I resealed everything so carefully that even forensic analysis would have difficulty detecting the switch without chemical testing. Chemistry was always my best subject, I murmured to my reflection in the kitchen window, my voice carrying a satisfaction I hadn't felt in decades. Too bad you never bothered to remember that, Mike. Returning the doctored tube to Mike's car felt like placing a time bomb with a very specific and very personal target. I arranged everything exactly as I'd found it, ensuring that no detail would betray my presence. But as I closed the glove compartment, I noticed something else, a small velvet box hidden beneath the car manual. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a diamond ring that could have paid for a small car. An engagement ring for Crystal. The discovery hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and confirming what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. This wasn't just an affair, it was a complete replacement. Mike wasn't just cheating on me, he was auditioning my successor. I closed the box and returned it to its hiding place, but the image of that ring burned in my memory like acid. Crystal would never get the chance to wear it, not if my plan worked, and my plan was going to work beautifully. The hardest part was acting normal while carrying the weight of what I'd done, what I'd set in motion, what was about to unfold with the inexorable certainty of a chemical reaction. Mike came home that Tuesday evening whistling, actually whistling, satisfied from his afternoon activities with Crystal. The sound grated against my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard, but I forced myself to smile and ask about his day. "Great workout," he said, kissing my cheek with lips that had been God knows where just hours before. Really worked up a sweat. The double entendre was so obvious it was almost insulting. Did he think I was completely oblivious? Did 40 years of marriage mean so little that he couldn't even be bothered to construct believable lies? "I'm sure you did," I replied with a sweetness that should have alerted him to danger. But Mike was too self-absorbed to notice the edge in my voice, too confident in his deception to recognize the threat sitting across from him at the dinner table. We ate in relative silence, pot roast and vegetables, the same meal I'd been making for decades, while slowly disappearing into domestic invisibility. Mike scrolled through his phone between bites, probably reading messages from Crystal, planning their next rendezvous while sitting in the same kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals for him. The irony was delicious. He was literally consuming my labor while plotting my replacement, completely unaware that his next encounter with Crystal would be his last as a free man. Wednesday passed with agonizing slowness. Mike went to work, came home, ate the dinner I'd prepared with the same detached politeness he'd shown me for years. No unusual phone calls, no emergency trips to the hospital. The adhesive hadn't been used yet, which meant their Tuesday afternoon had been devoted to other activities. That meant the tube was still intact, still waiting for the perfect moment to transform from innocent bedroom accessory to instrument of justice. Thursday brought more of the same carefully orchestrated normalcy. I tended my garden, ran errands, played the part of the dutiful wife one last time, while my heart hammered with anticipation. Mike remained oblivious, planning his future with Crystal, while the instrument of his downfall sat waiting in his glove compartment, like a patient serpent. But Friday would be different. Friday was their big day. Their special afternoon when Crystal's husband was conveniently out of town on business and they could play house without interruption. I knew their schedule by heart. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Crystal would open her door wearing something designed to entice. Mike would enter with his usual masculine confidence, believing himself to be the conquering hero in his own sordid romance novel. And sometime in the next 2 hours, they would discover that betrayal comes with a price that couldn't be calculated in dollars or broken hearts. All I had to do was wait, and I was very good at waiting. I'd been waiting for 40 years. As Friday afternoon approached, I positioned myself in my garden with a clear view of Crystal's house. I was trimming roses when Mike's Mercedes pulled into her driveway at exactly 2:28. Crystal appeared in her doorway wearing a red silk robe that left nothing to the imagination. Even from my garden, I could see her hungry smile as she pulled Mike inside. I continued my gardening, humming softly to myself as I pruned and watered. Mrs. Patterson waved from her porch, probably wondering how I could seem so calm while my husband openly cavorted with his mistress. If only she knew what was about to happen. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. 3 o'clock, 3:15, 3:30. Any moment now, they would discover that some chemical reactions are irreversible. I found myself thinking about the irony of it all. For 40 years, I'd been the perfect wife, supportive, invisible, endlessly accommodating. I'd made myself smaller and smaller until I'd nearly disappeared entirely. But chemistry had taught me something that life hadn't. Sometimes the most powerful reactions come from the most unassuming elements. Cyanoacrylate seems harmless in its tube, just like I seemed harmless in my kitchen. But under the right conditions, with the right catalyst, it becomes something unstoppable. Something that bonds so completely, so permanently, that separation becomes impossible without causing permanent damage. That's what Mike and Crystal were about to discover. They thought they were getting pleasure, intimacy, and connection. Instead, they were about to become a living metaphor for their own toxic relationship, permanently stuck together in the most humiliating way possible. 3:47. The scream that erupted from Crystal's house could have awakened the dead. "Help!" Crystal's voice shattered the afternoon quiet like glass exploding. "Somebody help us!" I looked up from my roses with carefully practiced surprise as neighbors began emerging from their houses like prairie dogs sensing danger. Mrs. Patterson dropped her watering can with a metallic clang. Mr. Bradley came running from his garage, still holding a wrench. "Call 911!" Mike's voice joined Crystal's in a harmony of panic that was almost musical in its desperation. "We're stuck! We can't get apart!" The screaming continued, growing more frantic by the second, punctuated by what sounded like furniture being knocked over and frantic struggling. I set down my pruning shears and walked to my fence, playing the concerned neighbor to perfection. "What's happening?" Mrs. Patterson called out, her face pale with shock and barely concealed excitement at this unprecedented neighborhood drama. "I think they need help," I replied with just the right amount of worry in my voice, my acting skills honed by decades of pretending everything was fine. "Should someone call for an ambulance?" But Tom Bradley was already on his radio, calling for the fire department. As a volunteer firefighter himself, he understood that this wasn't a job for paramedics. This was going to require specialized equipment, industrial solvents, and probably a very creative incident report. Within 15 minutes, our quiet suburban street looked like a disaster zone. 2 fire trucks, an ambulance, and 3 police cars lined Crystal's driveway, while neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering and pointing. The screaming had evolved into something more desperate now, alternating between panic and rage as Mike and Crystal realized the full scope of their predicament. "What the hell did you buy?" Mike's voice carried through Crystal's open windows, his tone shifting from confusion to fury. "I didn't buy anything!" Crystal shrieked back. "You brought that tube! This is your fault!" Even in their crisis, they were turning on each other like animals in a trap. Tom Bradley emerged from Crystal's house, shaking his head, his face grim with professional concern and barely suppressed amusement. "We're going to need the industrial solvents," he called to his crew, trying to maintain his composure. "And possibly a surgeon. I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of emergency response." "What exactly are we dealing with, Tom?" Officer Reynolds asked, pulling out his incident report notepad. "Industrial-grade adhesive," Tom replied, his voice carrying across the crowd of neighbors. "Someone replaced their personal lubricant with what appears to be cyanoacrylate superglue. They're bonded at multiple contact points. This is going to require specialized intervention." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Patterson actually clutched her pearls. "How is that even possible?" Janet Morrison asked, her nurse's training making her naturally curious about the medical implications. "Cyanoacrylate bonds instantly with skin contact and body heat," Tom explained, unconsciously providing a chemistry lesson to the gathered audience. "Once it sets, only specialized solvents can break the molecular bonds without causing severe tissue damage." I stood among my neighbors, nodding along with appropriate concern while inwardly marveling at the elegant precision of my revenge. Mike and Crystal weren't just physically stuck, they were trapped in the most humiliating situation imaginable, requiring public rescue from their sexual escapade gone wrong. Dr. Sarah Williams arrived with the ambulance crew, disappearing into Crystal's house with a bag of medical supplies and what appeared to be a small chemistry kit. The rescue operation took 4 excruciating hours, 4 hours during which Mike and Crystal had to be carefully separated using specialized solvents while maintaining their dignity under sheets that did nothing to preserve their privacy. When they finally emerged, transported to separate gurneys and still partially covered by medical blankets, the entire neighborhood had gathered to witness their walk of shame. Crystal's face was streaked with tears and chemical burns. Mike looked like a broken man, his eyes hollow with the realization that his secret was now the most public thing about him. The neighborhood buzzed with a mixture of shock and barely contained laughter. 40 years of marriage, and Mike had finally given me something I'd always wanted, the complete and utter destruction of his dignity. But the chemical emergency was only the beginning. While Mike and Crystal were being treated for chemical burns at Denver General, I made a decision that would seal their fate permanently. I called the FBI Financial Crimes Hotline. "I'd like to report investment fraud," I said calmly into the phone. "I have documentation that my husband and his mistress have been operating a fraudulent investment scheme called Golden Horizon Travel Ventures." I'd been sitting on this evidence for months, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. The superglue incident had given me that moment, when they were both helpless, humiliated, and unable to destroy evidence or flee. The FBI agent who took my call was immediately interested. "Do you have financial records, ma'am?" "Bank transfers, forged documents, fake business registrations, and evidence of multiple victims," I replied. "I can provide everything you need." Within 48 hours, federal agents had obtained search warrants for both Crystal's house and Mike's business records. What they found exceeded even the evidence I'd provided. Crystal Martinez, it turned out, was quite the entrepreneur. Her house contained evidence of multiple investment fraud schemes, false identity documents, and correspondence with over a dozen men she'd been simultaneously romancing for financial gain across 3 different states. Golden Horizon Travel Ventures was just the tip of the iceberg. Crystal had convinced various men to invest in non-existent yoga studios, fictional real estate developments, and imaginary import-export businesses. The total amount stolen, over $1 million. Mike's name was on several documents, his bank accounts showed suspicious transfers, and his participation in the scheme was thoroughly documented. He wasn't just an unfaithful husband, he was a willing accomplice to federal crimes. As I watched FBI agents carry boxes of evidence from Crystal's house, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced in decades. I hadn't just gotten revenge, I delivered justice on a silver platter. The next few days brought a cascade of federal charges that transformed my humiliation into complete vindication. Mike was arrested at the hospital, still bandaged and barely able to walk, on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The federal prosecutors had an airtight case thanks to the evidence I'd carefully preserved and the additional documentation they'd seized from Crystal's house. Crystal herself was facing an even longer list of federal charges: wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and operating a criminal enterprise across state lines. The young woman who'd once taunted me about moving to a senior community was now looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The best part? As the whistleblower who had reported the crimes and the primary victim of the financial fraud, I was entitled to full restitution of any money stolen from our joint accounts. Plus, with Mike facing serious federal charges, the divorce settlement shifted dramatically in my favor. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, everything Mike owned that had been purchased with proceeds from the fraud, which was most of our assets, reverted to me as the defrauded spouse. I would keep the house, the retirement funds, his investment portfolio, and even his precious Mercedes. Mike would get a federal prison jumpsuit and whatever meager possessions he could afford with a public defender's budget. 6 months later, I stood in my garden, watching the morning sun illuminate the new sign I'd installed by the gate: Beth's Garden Where Beautiful. Things grow from strong roots. The neighborhood had transformed around me like a scene from a redemption story. Crystal's house stood empty, a for sale sign leaning drunkenly in the overgrown yard where weeds had reclaimed her once pristine landscaping. The story of the superglue incident had become local legend, whispered about at coffee shops and dinner parties throughout Denver, though no one had ever traced the chemical mishap back to me. Why would they? I was just the wronged wife, the victim of my husband's betrayal. No one suspected that the quiet elementary school teacher might know enough chemistry to engineer such an elaborate revenge. In their minds, I was still the invisible woman who'd spent 40 years making sandwiches and tending gardens. That invisibility had become my greatest weapon. Janet arrived with morning coffee and fresh gossip, settling beside me on the porch swing Mike had never liked. "Did you hear about the Martinez investigation?" she asked, her voice bubbling with excitement. Turns out she'd been running similar scams in 3 other states. The FBI thinks she might have stolen over $1 million from various men over the past 5 years. "Really?" I replied, stirring my coffee while studying nonchalance. "How fascinating." And Mike's cellmate apparently tried to convince him to write a tell-all book about his experience. Can you imagine? How I lost everything to industrial adhesive, a cautionary tale. We both laughed, but I could see the question lurking behind Janet's eyes. She was a smart woman, my friend Janet. Smart enough to notice things, smart enough to piece together coincidences, smart enough to wonder how a chemistry teacher might have access to industrial-grade adhesives, smart enough to never ask questions she didn't want answered. "How do you feel about everything that's happened?" she asked, studying my face with the careful attention of someone conducting an interrogation disguised as friendly concern. I considered the question while watching a butterfly land on my prize roses, the same roses I'd been tending when I first discovered Mike's betrayal. Mike was serving an 8-year sentence for fraud and conspiracy. Crystal had been deported back to whatever country she'd originally escaped from, her fake identities finally catching up with her. My house was mine, my bank account was healthy, and my reputation had been transformed from pitied victim to inspiring survivor. "You know what I feel?" I said finally, sipping my coffee with hands that no longer trembled with humiliation or rage. Grateful. Grateful? 40 years of marriage taught me something valuable about chemistry, I explained. Some reactions take time to develop, but when they finally occur, the results can be quite explosive. Janet laughed, but I could see the question in her eyes. She was a smart woman, my friend Janet. Smart enough to notice things. Smart enough to suspect. Smart enough to never ask questions she didn't want answered. That afternoon, I opened my mailbox to find a letter from the local community college. They were looking for someone to teach basic chemistry to adult learners, people who'd never had the chance to pursue their dreams the first time around. The irony was perfect. I called the number on the letterhead and scheduled an interview for the following week. At 62 years old, I was finally going to have the career I'd given up at 22. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the trembling, humiliated creature who'd stood in this same spot 6 months ago. This woman had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. This woman had learned that revenge, like chemistry, was simply a matter of understanding the right reactions. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine and my old chemistry textbooks, reviewing molecular structures and reaction principles under the golden hour light. A car drove slowly past my house, probably another curiosity seeker hoping to glimpse the scene of the infamous super glue incident. I raised my glass in a mock toast to my invisible audience. "Here's to chemistry," I said to the empty street. "May it always give us exactly what we deserve." Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, ambulance, fire truck, or police car rushing to handle someone else's emergency. But here in my garden, in my home, in my life, everything was finally perfectly peaceful. The butterfly returned to my roses, its delicate wings catching the last light of day. Beautiful things do grow from strong roots, I reflected. Sometimes they just need the right catalyst to help them bloom, and sometimes that catalyst is revenge served at exactly the right temperature. 1 year later, I stood in front of my adult chemistry class, pointing to a molecular diagram on the whiteboard. Chemical bonds, I explained to my eager students, can be incredibly strong, but they can also be broken under the right conditions. The key is understanding exactly which catalyst to apply and when. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "What happens if you use the wrong catalyst, Professor Thompson?" I smiled, remembering a certain tube of industrial adhesive and its spectacular results. "Well," I said carefully, "let's just say that some reactions can be quite permanent, and sometimes that's exactly what we need." The class laughed, thinking I was being metaphorical. If only they knew. After class, I walked across campus to my car, a brand new red convertible I'd bought with money from Mike's forfeited assets. At 63, I was finally living the life I'd dreamed of at 22. Better late than never. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "I know what you did." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Prove it." The response came immediately. "I don't want to prove it. I want to learn how you did it. I need help with my own chemistry problem." I laughed out loud in the parking lot, attracting curious stares from passing students. Apparently, my reputation was spreading beyond the neighborhood. I typed back, "Office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 to 4 p.m. Bring your textbook." Because if 40 years of marriage had taught me anything, it was this. There are a lot of women out there who could use a good chemistry lesson, and I was finally ready to teach them. If you found my story of justice and scientific precision compelling, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to our channel. Please share your thoughts about my journey in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that your hidden talents could right a wrong? I'd love to hear your own stories of unexpected strength. To listen to another tale like mine, click on the suggested video to your left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery.